I was sharing actually last week. We had a convening in Chicago for the Covenant House leaders, and I was sharing with those leaders that I really had kind of a come to Jesus moment on LaSalle Street in Chicago. And I was walking on my lunch break down LaSalle Street and came across a homeless man. Now, I wasn't paying attention. I was in my own thoughts, in my own world. And he had asked for money, and I kind of had ignored him just like everybody else was. And as I was walking past him, he cursed at me and said, you're there in your $5,000 suit and you can't even give me enough money for a sandwich. Now, my suit was probably from TJ Maxx. It definitely was not a $5,000 suit as an entry level.
You had the confidence of a $5,000 suit. Yeah.
Right. And I stopped and I looked at him, and as I looked at him, he looked me right in the eyes, and I'm convinced that was Jesus cursing at me and telling me that I needed to change my worldview.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. My name is Dr. Haig, and our mission here is to connect Christians one coffee hour conversation at a time. The statistics are staggering. Every year, an estimated 4.2 million young people in the United States experience the vulnerability of homelessness. It is a crisis that touches the very heart of our communities. But amidst this challenge, there shines a beacon of hope, an organization dedicated to standing in the gap, offering not just shelter, but a pathway to opportunity and a chance to rebuild. Today, we have the privilege of delving into the vital work of Covenant House with the man at the helm of this mission, President and CEO, William Bedrossian. Together, we'll explore the complex issues that lead to teenage homelessness, uncover potential preventative measures, and discuss tangible ways we could all contribute to help those in need. But before we jump into today's conversation, I do want to read our verse of the week, which comes from Proverbs chapter 14, verse 31. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt to their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. With that said, please grab a cup of coffee and enjoy this Christ-centered conversation. Welcome, Bill, to the Christ and Coffee podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Important question. How do you drink your coffee?
I actually don't drink coffee.
Okay.
I'm one of those few people who wakes up with an abundance of energy, and caffeine actually makes me really jittery. So stay away from coffee. Love the smell of it. A little coffee ice cream in the evening I can do, but don't drink coffee. Actually, I have a funny story. We were on our way back from our honeymoon many years ago, and we stopped in Japan, and I accidentally ordered coffee in a train station. I thought it was hot chocolate. And my wife describes this scene. I'm a very big man. And so she said it was like a scene out of Godzilla where Bill is walking back and forth, pacing frantically. And there's all these people who barely come up to my shoulder, just looking scared on this train platform. So I definitely stay away from coffee at this point.
That's probably wise. So it's crazy how certain people with high energy tend to have the opposite effect with caffeine.
Yeah.
So you just stayed. When did you discover that this is not good for you? Is it right away or off?
Probably very young. I think if you looked at my report cards as a kid, they were always, Billy talks too much, Billy moves around too much, Billy doesn't sit still. So, yeah,
that's great. So tell me about your upbringing then. What was it like? It
was great. Had loving parents. My parents had me very young as they were teenagers, so got to I think one of the benefits of that is I got to see my parents develop as adults. They didn't know what they were doing maybe, but they loved me, and I got to see my dad really work through college and graduate school and become an executive. So I got to see in real time what it takes to be successful and all the hard things that go along with that. And then just, struggling being poor for, growing up helped me appreciate kind of the things that we ended up having. And then my parents, we grew up in Philadelphia, and right before high school, we moved to Chicagoland, and my parents began to become foster parents and ended up adopting 8 of my siblings. So I'm the oldest of 12. And so that really exposed me to kind of a different part of society that I wasn't familiar with, and really opened my eyes to opportunities for how families can support one another and where the church can really connect in ways that can both support kids, but also families in crisis.
So let me understand this. You're the oldest of a family of 12,
12 kids, yeah,
and 4 of them are biological,
that's right.
and then the rest are just foster care.
Well, they were adopted. They came through foster care, but my parents adopted them
So
mostly as infants or very young. So they, grew up in our house.
wow.
Yeah.
So you grew up kind of poor, and then when your parents made it, then they're like, we have all this money now. Let's adopt as many kids as possible. How did that go?
I mean, it wasn't really because of money. It was because of mission. My mom, I think she was put on this earth to care for kids. And I think as they had additional resources, they felt like they had a responsibility to take care of kids who were in need. And so they not only were foster parents and adoptive parents, but they were also champions for foster care and taking care of kids. And they just lived it out in their lives too. I mean, there was lots of kids in the neighborhood who needed support or needed something, and our house was the place you would go for a meal or to hang out or to be safe.
And where was that conviction or calling coming from?
I mean, definitely their faith. Yeah. So they both, grew up in faith in their families and was a part of who they were, and that got, translated down to us.
That's amazing. Was it a multi-ethnic upbringing, or like how many? What was the
All
mix?
my adopted siblings are Black. So multi-ethnic in a relatively wealthy white community. So lots of challenges with that too. For my siblings in particular, they all have stories of racist experiences, and I think for me, it was one of the things that really opened up my eyes to some of the systemic challenges that young Black kids in particular face, that I never personally faced, even though we may have been poor. There were other factors that my siblings faced that were different, that complicated or confounded the situations that they were in. So it's really been a part of my life personal mission, but also now at Covenant House, thinking about how do we support communities and what our responsibilities are at a systemic level and not just the interpersonal level.
So not just like give a fish,
Right.
teach them how to fish sort of mindset for
Right.
the nonprofit world. So what did you do? Like after college, what was that like?
Well, I studied finance, and I wanted to be a stockbroker.
Okay.
And I briefly worked at the Chicago Board of Trade the summer after I graduated. And I was sharing, actually last week, we had a convening in Chicago for the Covenant House leaders. And I was sharing with those leaders that I really had kind of a come to Jesus moment on LaSalle Street in Chicago. And I was walking on my lunch break down LaSalle Street and came across a homeless man. Now, I wasn't paying attention. I was in my own thoughts, in my own world. And he had asked for money, and I kind of had ignored him just like everybody else was. And as I was walking past him, he cursed at me and said, you're there in your $5,000 suit and you can't even give me enough money for a sandwich. Now, my suit was probably from TJ Maxx. It definitely was not a $5,000 suit as an entry level.
You had the confidence of a $5,000 suit. Yeah.
Right. And I stopped and I looked at him. And as I looked at him, he looked me right in the eyes. And I'm convinced that was Jesus cursing at me and telling me that I needed to change my worldview. And so I feel like at that point, I was really convicted. I gave him the little money I had in my wallet. And then I couldn't forget that moment. And so in the coming weeks, I started kind of evaluating my options. And by that fall, I was attending graduate school at the Loyola University School of Social Work. And I was working at a center that worked for children that were behaviorally challenged and weren't able to be with their parents. And so it really completely changed kind of the course of my life. I mean, I think in hindsight, I always knew I was called to this type of ministry, and probably, got jaded in college by the thoughts of making a lot of money and driving a nice car and things like that. But
$5,000 suit. Yeah.
yeah, but luckily, Jesus cursed at me and got me set back on my straight and narrow there.
So that's an interesting theological thing right there. The fact that Jesus could potentially curse you out or yell at you. And I feel like people who have these calls to them, sometimes they think it's more like wonderful and nice versus God yelling at you, I need you to do this, step up. And they could come in the most random ways. So you felt like in your spirit that this was beyond some just angry homeless person, but this is...
Yeah, I think for me, it's like probably at most moments in my life to require change, it's a slap upside the head rather than a gentle push for me, just
Yeah, yeah.
personally. That's how I kind of walk in the world. And so I think in that scenario, he told me what I needed to hear. I probably wouldn't have responded to a gentle, cry or plea. And that was what I needed. And I think God knew that. And that's what it took.
And then what brought you out to California?
Warmth.
Warmth. Okay, that's a great reason.
Yeah, I think warmth, and then the prospects of after graduate school, I came to work for the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. It's the largest child welfare system in the world, and I was full of optimism and wanted to make change in the biggest way possible. So I sought out both warmth and the largest child welfare system in the world.
So it's a huge need. So what are some of the unique challenges of the LA, Californian foster care child services? Because I feel like I'm learning how vast and crazy the challenge is. 1 out of every 10 foster care citizens in America are from LA County.
Yeah.
What about LA that makes it so difficult, or this is such an epidemic?
Well, I mean, I think it's a function of the population, right?
Okay.
And then it's a function of how policy is administered. And so this dates back to the 90s. And, I don't want to get too much into a history lesson.
No, that's good.
But early in social work history, the reason social works would be involved with families were to support them in times of crisis. And over time, it became a risk management issue. And so different jurisdictions administered that differently. So if anything might happen, we better take that kid away just so it doesn't happen. And I think Los Angeles County was the biggest, probably instigator of, hey, we want to avoid getting in trouble, so we're going to take kids into care. And at one point had taken over 50,000 kids into care in Los Angeles County back in the 90s. And so there weren't enough foster homes, there weren't enough qualified relatives to be able to care for kids. And then you start hearing about bad things happening because they're not qualified caregivers for these kids. And I think where it works well, even in large cities, it's in jurisdictions where kids are taken into care only if there's a legitimate safety issue, not a risk issue. And so communities work really hard to support families in crisis so kids can stay in their homes. And only as a last resort would a kid be taken into care. And so Los Angeles County did then go through kind of a renaissance and go back to some of that theology and invested a lot of money in-home support and keeping kids home. And then, tragically a kid dies, and then the public outcry and then the public policy responses are generally go back to trying to avoid risk, and then more kids come back into care. So it's a vicious cycle that's happened in Los Angeles County. And I think there's lots of places that, they've been a little bit more convicted in how to keep kids home with their families whenever possible. And I think that's always the best solution. The truth is these kids, when they turn 18, if they don't get adopted and feel really connected to the family they're in, they go back to their families of origin anyway.
Yeah.
So the opportunity to keep them safe in their own home, I think, is always the best option.
So when you use the word risk, that's just up for interpretation, what that means? Or is there like this is what risk means?
Yeah, there's actually tools that are used to determine risk based on the age of a youth, the number of incidences that have happened in a family, if there's an injury, maybe even the location of injury, the head versus a foot. So there's a variety of factors and tools that are used to determine risk. And that's a newer technology, in the 2000s, where, kind of you're using actuarial assessments to determine what risk might mean in the future. As a social worker, I always think, you can't take the human element out of it. And as a person of faith, like I always believe that healing and second chances is important. And so I do think there's scenarios where you just have to remove a kid so that they can be safe and they can thrive. But in most scenarios, I think there's opportunities to work with a family to keep them together or to reunite them.
Yeah, because most parents want to keep their kids. It's just if there's drug abuse or some other stuff, there's usually something else going on. It's very rare that there's this family out there who hates their kid, right?
Oh, yeah. It's almost always, as a proportion of kids that are taken in the system, it's largely neglect and inability to appropriately care for a kid that stems from either mental health use or a lot of times simply poverty.
Yeah.
not enough money to pay for food or to have a stable housing environment. So then they end up in multifamily units that aren't safe, and maybe someone else is abusing a kid. So very rarely have I met in my 30 years of doing this a mother or father who didn't want their kid or didn't want to
Right.
care for their kid. And then I think the truth is that minority populations are disproportionately affected because of who's calling in these things. So I don't think, in fact, I know there's not any less problems with white families or Asian families than there are with black families or Hispanic families. But because of economics that are involved in Los Angeles County around those issues and around mandated reporter laws, what you see is a huge disproportionate number of kids of color in the system.
Wow. And out of kids in foster care or homeless teens, this is interconnecting to just homeless crises, crime. It's like the core of so many other potential problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core of the problems, and I did some studying around this in graduate school many years ago, is kind of the isolation of families from one another. And so, in early parts of our country history and most societies, what makes societies work really well are families interacting with one another and supporting one another. And as we've become more and more isolated in the way that we live through technology, someone else's kid is someone else's problem. Whereas my dad might spank the kid down the neighborhood, in the 70s, now he would get sued for doing something like that. At that time, that parent was like, thank you for keeping my kid in line. And so this idea of, caring for kids together and, supporting one another when you're in crisis just is not the same anymore. So, yeah.
I've noticed that on a little level. Like when growing up playing sports, I would remember all the parents talking more. There'd be more of like a collaboration between the team and the parents, and that. Now it's like everyone's very hesitant just to talk to each other, and they're playing on the same kids sports team, and the sadness of this world we live in. We're more connected than ever before, but more disconnected than ever because people are scared. Everything is recorded. People are scared to make mistakes.
Right.
People don't feel like they have that civic obligation to help the person down the street. And especially if a kid has a single parent home, then the men need to step up and help, be a role model. My dad growing up, a lot of my friends with single parent homes, they would call him Baba because he would, just show love, no agenda, but just be a fatherly figure in the community. And something like that does wonders for the community. And this fear-based that we can't even dabble in that kind of like civics is a huge part of this. So it's amazing work that you do at Covenant. So how did you shift from working for the government to working for a Christian organization? What happened there?
Well, yeah, ultimately I became really frustrated, because of politics around the welfare system and the changes in policy as the result of people in elected offices and not being able to do what I thought was most important, which was work with families to keep kids in their homes. And so I left first to a foster care and adoption and family support agency. And then about 11 years ago, I came to work for Covenant House, which primarily is working with young people who are experiencing homelessness. And there's a huge crossover. So about 50% of the kids we work with have been system involved with either child welfare or probation system and have, come out of those systems and then just don't have the resources or the places to be able to live. And so they end up homeless and vulnerable.
So walk me through like not a typical case study. I hate to say that, but just a typical scenario. How does a teenager end up homeless? And then how does Covenant help that teenager?
So, I mean, I think there's kind of three primary drivers of homelessness in what we see across the 34 cities that we live in. The first is coming out of systems. At the age of 18, you're deemed an adult, and therefore you're now on your own and forced to fend yourself after you've been through a system where you haven't really come from a family environment. So you're really ill-equipped to be able to care for yourself. The second scenario, I find just as troubling is about 40% of the kids we work with identify as LGBTQ. and they're almost all rejected by their families in the name of religion and or conservative cultures.
Wow.
And so these are kids who may have actually come from loving families, and then they turn 18 and they're bold enough to, talk to their parents or their communities about their identity, and then they're rejected, and then they're on their own in isolation. And then the third is really kind of poverty and some of the system issues that we talked about. So, like, the welfare system often provides some support for mothers and children, but then their child becomes 18 and adult, and they no longer are receiving support for them, and so that they can't live or they can't go into a shelter or certain types of housing, and so the kids become victims of the system. And so, I think what's most troubling to me is, like, you have all these 18-year-olds coming into homelessness when their brains aren't even finished developing. And, science says now that most humans, their brain doesn't stop developing to the age of 26.
Yeah, yeah.
And you see that in families where there's affluence, the kids are staying home until they're 24, 25, sometimes 30, because it's just so expensive to live, and it's so hard to find jobs that can afford. And then we're expecting these kids coming out of foster care or being rejected or coming out of poverty to just get a job and be okay at the age of 18. And so it's really unrealistic. And it's why I think the homeless population is on a trajectory to explode if there's not some significant interventions. So the way that we intervene is really try to meet young people where they are. We do street outreach in every city that we're in, so we're out there looking for kids. But the truth is, most of the kids we don't find on the street, they find us. So they use their smartphone and they Google, where do I go if I'm a homeless kid, and they come to a Covenant House site. We do street outreach as really ministry, as an extension to show, hey, there's people out here who care about you, that are looking for you when you're ready. If you're not ready now, we're here for you. And so I think it's one of the most loving things we do, is going out there and forming relationships with young people on the street who've never been cared for by an adult, to know that, hey, there's someone coming out here looking for me. So our programs are really designed to be holistic, to meet a young person where they are. So coming in, and depending on if they haven't finished school, we'll get them, their high school diploma or their GED, and get them into a training program or a college. If they have mental health issues, we'll, get them connected to mental health resources at our site or an external source if they need it. We have health clinics at most of our sites to be able to ensure that the kids' medical needs are being met. And then really it's taking them on a housing journey that will result in stability. And that there's kind of three components to that. It's helping a young person develop a career, a job path that's going to enable them to afford where they want to live. It's creating a community support for them, so when they do leave our housing programs, they're not just on their own again in total isolation, and then they lose their job and then they're homeless again. So we're really trying to find connections for them. So thousands of volunteers every year at all of our sites are coming in and working with young people and forming relationships. And then finally, it's finding them the right type of housing. So we do shelter care, we do transitional housing, which gives young people up to 2 years to stay with us as they're going through that process. And then we do some more permanent types of housing that give them a longer runway to be able to stay with us. But what we've realized is there's just a massive gap in what's affordable for young people and the wages that are being paid.
Right.
So in the 250 largest cities in the US and Canada, even if you're making the living wage, so not a minimum wage, but the living wage, you can't afford a market rate 1-bedroom apartment in your city. So that means you have to work multiple living wage jobs just to afford a market rate apartment. It's just not feasible for most people. So we're really advocating for longer term housing opportunities for young people that match what they can afford. And we're actually now building what we're calling affordable for youth housing, where we're able to give them rents that are on a sliding scale based on their income that they have.
But the fact that people can't live off a living wage and need multiple living wages jobs, if this is not dealt with, this homeless thing is gonna, like you said, it's gonna be insane very soon.
It's not sustainable. If you look at the U.S. government HUD's own statistics, it's basically showing an increase of about 12% a year of people experiencing homelessness. So, I mean, you can imagine a decade from now, you're talking about 100% plus increase in people experiencing homelessness. It's untenable. So, the only real solution is additional housing that's affordable for people that are making the wages that can't now, supplement the rents that they have. So, I think it's a shift. The challenge is in such a big system like the US government is we're used to distributing resources in one way.
Yeah.
It's not working. It hasn't worked for generations. We've really got to be thoughtful about these solutions need to match the needs. We've got to build more housing. We've got to match the rents with what people are making.
Wow. Um, so then you worked for the California Covenant House, and then you worked your way up to the CEO position. What is your future vision for Covenant House as in this role of the top leadership role?
Yeah, so this year we went through a 2-year kind of study of landscape of youth homelessness as well as our own capacities, and just in January this year has really started talking about a vision that we think can end youth homelessness as we know it. And when we say end youth homelessness, what we're talking about is a functional zero, which means if a young person was experiencing homelessness, there's a safe bed for them somewhere where they could stay. They don't have to be on the street. They don't have to be couch surfing. The federal government went through a process like this with veterans. And the way they did it was, hey, we're going to count all the veterans that are homeless. We're going to create enough resources to make sure that there's a bed for every veteran that needs one. Now, we all know that there's still veterans that are experiencing homelessness, but if that veteran wanted a home, there's the number of beds out there to be able to meet that need. The biggest problem in doing this for youth is there's not a unified definition of youth homelessness. And so the way the federal government describes it might be different than how it's described in California versus Maryland. And so these counts that we have around youth homelessness are really ineffective and undercounting the number of kids in each community who are homeless. And so in the places that we've seen there be really effective resourcing of this issue, we're generally seeing between 10 and 15% of the total homeless population is youth. So if we're able to kind of really count it and then attribute the resources based on that percentage, we could legitimately come up with solutions that would end youth homelessness. So that's what we're advocating for. That's what we're shooting for. We can't do it. We're in 34 cities. There's thousands of cities that have needs. So we're really expanding kind of the way we work to partner with other organizations to really develop national partnerships. We recently announced a partnership with Chapin Hall, which is an independent think tank that used to be associated with University of Chicago, that is experts in data around foster care and youth homelessness. And so instead of us trying to develop a team that can be experts, they're going to be the experts for us and take all the data that we have and help us really tell the story of where young people are coming from, what's working that's enabling them to be successful, so that we can share that information and really help cities across America and Canada and Latin America be able to help young people.
That's amazing. Yeah, this partnership approach is definitely key. And then also this community approach versus just a specific problem of one person, but seeing the whole environment needing to be shifted to provide long-term solutions to this crisis is amazing. Do you find that like certain cities do a better job in this country, and what could be learned from? I know like LA has a large population, but how is your relationship with government and how to collaborate there?
Yeah, so in every city we work, we have to partner with the government. A portion of our resources come from the government. Programs don't really work if there's not support from the government. But different jurisdictions do a better job than others. Sometimes it's a resource issue, but often it's a priority issue. And the way that I really think we need to start looking at homelessness is we've got to be thinking more about prevention rather than dealing with it after it happens. Right. So it's what I talked about before, housing, having enough housing, but it's also thinking about for young people, if we know why young people are becoming homeless, and we do, like, let's get upstream. Let's make sure that every kid coming out of foster care has the opportunity for stable placement and longer term support until they're independent. Let's make sure if a kid is in a family that's not going to accept them for their identity, that we can create support networks for them. And same thing around poverty. Like there's ways to ensure that a kid doesn't have to go from living with their family in a shelter to homeless just because they're 18 now. So I really we're emphasizing a lot of work around prevention, which includes education and community support. We've seen some cities across the Americas do an amazing job of education that has resulted in much better outcomes and lower incidences of homelessness as a result of that. So if you go to Toronto, for example, the Covenant House there has done such a good job educating police departments, schools, TSA, that everybody kind of knows what to do when they come across a young person experiencing homelessness. And as a result of being educated, they have a greater level of compassion. And so it's really created a lot more support, financial support for solutions there, not just for Covenant House, but for systems. And I think they do a much better job there. So that's something that we can all learn from whatever city that we live in and really start creating better awarenesses and attracting more resources to help young people.
Amazing. What would you advise maybe some listeners right now? Like, how could they help? How could they be part of the solution versus just complain about the problems?
I mean, there's a few things. I mean, I think the first thing starts in our heart, and what a young person needs in their greatest time of crisis is not judgment, it's love and acceptance and someone that's willing to even just look at them as a human. Most of the kids who I've met who've spent any significant time on the street have said the hardest thing about it is not the elements, it's that people don't look at them as humans or having value. So for me, personally, I think, when someone who's homeless talks to me or I see someone, asking them how they're doing, asking them what they need, and using my knowledge to be able to connect into something if they want that. I know there's a lot of people that say, don't give someone, any money because they're going to use it for drugs or, this or that. But the truth is, if someone's saying they need money for food, you can buy them a meal. But sometimes they just need to be listened to be, to be heard, to be seen. So I would start there, just a smile and a like humanization of the person that you see can go a really long way. And besides that, I really encourage people to find the organizations that are effectively working with the population that you're passionate about. If it's kids, Covenant House is a great option, but there's also lots of other amazing organizations that are doing good work. And we're all under-resourced for the need that is out there. So, especially right now where we're unsure how government dollars are going to be redistributed, we really need to, come together as a community and say, hey, this is an important issue, and we're going to treat it as such by giving of our resources. And then the other thing is just education, educating yourself, really learning about the issue, why kids are becoming homeless. I have yet to meet a kid who chose to be homeless because if it wasn't a safety issue.
Right.
So these aren't, quote unquote punks or bad kids. These are kids who have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives and as a result are experiencing homelessness. And when they are given the opportunity to have the right environment, sometimes that right environment means like psychiatric care to be able to get properly medicated and deal with mental health issues or treatment for addiction issues. But those addiction issues stem from abuse issues,
Right.
And things that happen to them. So just that level of compassion and understanding that this isn't something they chose for themselves. The other thing about young people and why I love working with young people is every young person I've ever met still has hopes and dreams of what they want their future to look like and who they want to be as adults. And that's the most powerful leverage we have is we want that for you too. So let's use that as the motivation to keep moving forward every day. And I find it really inspirational to be around on a daily basis. I get the opportunity to be at Covenant House campuses where there's shelters and there's programs where kids are. And, some kids are excited about getting their first job. Some kids are excited about getting into college. Some kids are excited about a certification, but just to see that hope in them for accomplishing little things just gives me hope that any one of these kids could be successful as an adult.
That's amazing. What makes Covenant House special and unique?
I mean, I think there's a couple things. I think our brand is really built around family, meaning the way our staff treat young people is with love. It's one of our kind of values is loving young people. And so the way our staff interact with young people, it's not just transactional, it's very interpersonal. And so for a lot of young people, they'll tell me, like, this is the first time I've ever been accepted. This is the first time I've ever been loved for who I am. This is the first time anyone's ever cared enough to give me a Christmas gift or whatever it is. And I think that's the most powerful catalyst for moving a young person into success is feeling like they belong and feeling like they're worthy of love. And so I think that's the biggest difference. Not to say that that doesn't happen at other places, because I think that's a personal decision, but we really ingrain it in our culture. And then I think the other thing is that family also means even after you leave us, we're still your support system. So if you're 40 and you're experiencing a crisis, we're still the place that you can go, and we're going to figure out how to support you. So, I just, those values to me, I think are really what, translates our effectiveness with young people. And so I'm really proud of the way that, we kind of live out love, and hopefully to one another too as staff.
That's amazing. Can you share like one testimonial of someone you helped out, and like some testimony of your ministry?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure there's hundreds.
There's hundreds, and I have my favorites, and I think success looks very different for every young person. So, like there's one young woman that was an alumni that went to Harvard and became a PhD and is, like killing it out there. But, one of my favorite young people that I've ever worked with is in jail right now because of something he did before he was 18.
Wow.
And was on the right path. He was working, getting his own apartment, doing everything right. And then because he got bounced out of foster care when he was, 16 years old, ended up getting jammed up back then and is now in jail. I still talk to him. I still believe that, when he gets out, he's going to be a successful adult. I think, one of the stories that I've been sharing lately is a young man by the name of Derek. And Derek came to us at the age of 18 because his mother, who loved him, she was a nurse's aide, was caring for him and his sister, was not making enough money to be able to afford an apartment. So they were living in kind of single room or shelters down in Skid Row. And by the time Derek got to 6th, 7th grade, his mom had to go to work. Derek had to be responsible for getting his little sister to school. And so he stopped going to school. And then when he turned 18, none of the housing programs that the family was living in allowed an adult male to be there. So he became homeless, and he couch surfed for a little while. And even though he's like this loving, gracious guy, most families don't have the capacity to have another kid in their house. And so he ended up on the street and came to Covenant House. And I've never met a young person more enthusiastic and joyful to be at Covenant House. And he just did everything we asked him to do, everything society asked him to do. Got multiple jobs, went back into high school, got certifications for different employment skills, just everything. He was a good citizen. He was volunteering at Covenant House even when he was living there. And then he moved out on his own, and the place that he could afford was so nasty that I was just sad. I was like, this guy did everything that society's asked him to do, and he's living in this place that's not safe. It's not in a safe neighborhood. There's pestilence in here. The landlord doesn't care about taking care of this. Even in that scenario, in that horrible situation, Derek was taking in friends of his that couldn't afford rent and were coming and staying with him and sleeping on his couch. And so as a result of Derek's experience, we came up with this concept of affordable for youth housing, and had an amazing investor here in Southern California who said, hey, we'll give you some money to pilot this model. So we created an apartment complex where young people could come, and based on what they were making, would get a sliding scale rent. And the spaces were beautiful and dignified. They were singles because we don't want this to be permanent. We want them to work towards their dreams. But while they're with us, as long as they need to be, we want it to be beautiful and dignifying. So Derek, we asked Derek to move into this beautiful place. He's now the kind of the property manager of the site. He's creating culture around the site for other young people. He's working full time. He's killing it. And I'm just so proud of everything he's accomplished, but I'm also proud that we were able to kind of meet a need that wasn't out there before, because otherwise people like Derek, who's doing everything that society tells them they're supposed to do, they don't really have the opportunity to have stable housing.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love your emphasis on culture and kind of that being the key, and then finding like a leader like Derek and empowering his ability to create culture. And yeah, I think there's something more sad too than to hear someone doing everything right and it's still not enough. It's so demoralizing. And how do you keep hope? You seem like very optimistic, enthusiastic in the midst of all these tragic stories. What keeps you so hopeful and optimistic?
I mean, I guess the two things. One is my faith. I really believe that, there's opportunity for healing and transformation and, um, just I believe in the good of people. And so the second thing is, like I said, almost every day I get to be around a young person and I see them doing it. I see them doing hard things that most people could never do. And they're taking, little steps and they're getting to where they need to go. And so I know it's possible. And it's just exciting for me to think that, man, if we had more Covenant House sites or we had more agencies that were doing this type of work or more people investing in the future of young people, we'd have more successful young people. And so it's exciting for me just to see on a daily basis young people achieve great things.
That's great. Uh, Final question. If you had one message to tell to the church, what would it be?
Well, for me, it's really, I think the church has an incredible opportunity right now. The church has, I think, lost a lot of credibility over the last couple of generations as the result of a lot of judgment and convictions and political affiliations that don't make us attractive to large groups of people. And I think ultimately what the Bible is telling us to do, what Jesus is calling us to do, is to love one another. And my experience in working with this population, many of who've been rejected in the name of religion, in the name of the church, they're so willing to come to people who love them and accept them. And I think that's the opportunity for the church, is to live out this love and acceptance. And people don't have to be the same as you. People don't have to believe the same as you. They still are worthy of love and acceptance, just like Jesus lived out in the gospel. And so that would be my I guess great desire for the church, is to see us be, a people that are loving and caring, and especially towards people who are different than us.
Amen to that. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the end of the Christ and Coffee podcast. Stay caffeinated, my friends, and we'll see you next week.